You don't have to solve your whole life overnight, and you don't have to feel ashamed for being where you are. All you have to focus on is one small thing you can do today to get closer to where you want to be. Slowly and lightly, one step at a time, you can get there. This is the Wisdom Worth Knowing podcast. I'm your host, Craig Chamberlain. If it's your first time joining, welcome. Thanks for giving me a shot. You can subscribe to the podcast on all of the major social networks, including YouTube, Facebook, and Rumble. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Wisdom Worth Knowing is brought to you by Audible, where listening is the new reading. Get unlimited access to thousands of audiobooks completely free for 30 days. Sign up right now for this limited time offer for my listeners at audible.wisdomworthknowing.org. That's audible.wisdomworthknowing.org. You don't have to solve your whole life overnight. And you don't have to feel ashamed for being where you are. All you have to focus on is one small thing you can do today to get closer to where you want to be, slowly and lightly, one step at a time. You can get there. It's a pretty long quote. Generally, our quotes are relatively short. This one was kind of packed into that picture on the Facebook page. It got a wildly positive response. That first sentence does bother me a little bit, but we're going to unpack that a little bit. But then we're going to move into the rest of it, because I think as a whole, it's an excellent perspective on life. I think it actually is pretty lined up with my philosophy that I've started to adopt over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's also not just my philosophy. It's just something that I've really starting to take seriously, I think, in my life. And I think it is really, if it's something we adopt and we adopt it well, there's almost nothing we can't do. I mean, it literally, to me, unlocks the human potential for success in just about every area of our lives. So I am excited to talk about that today. I think that's kind of like, wow, if we can discover that secret, that's good for everybody, right? So let's start with that first sentence. Like I said, I do have some complaints about this, or some reservations, I should say, not complaints. It says, you don't have to solve your whole life overnight. I get what they're going for here. The biggest problem I see is that it immediately starts with this assumption that you can actually solve your life, as if your life has a resolution. And most of the problems we run into in most of our lives don't really have a problem or a solution, right? Our lives are extremely complex, so there's not a singular solution to the life problem. There's many different solutions that vary depending on our needs and our wants and our desires and our goals and the season of life we're in. But I get what they're getting at here. I think what they're implying is that, yes, you have an immediate problem now and you're not where you want to be. And so you can't solve that problem overnight. You know, whatever that goal you're trying to accomplish is not realistically something you can do in a day. So if you're trying to get in better shape, that's not something you can solve overnight. If you're trying to get a degree, that's not something you can solve overnight. If you're trying to change your career, get in a healthy, strong relationship, whatever your current vision you're aiming for might be, it's not a problem that can be solved overnight. So it's doubly true that you can't solve your whole life overnight, because generally speaking, we are a combination of desired goals. So obviously, we're not going to accomplish all of those in one day. And then that leads us to whether or not we handle failure and disappointment and setbacks well. And so that's the second part of the quote. It says, and you don't have to feel ashamed for being where you are. Even the greatest basketball players who have ever lived and still live miss most of their shots. Even though they practice countless hours, there's still failure in the things that they do. And failure is just part of the equation. Even if you are the best at whatever it is that you do, you're still going to fail. It's just a fact. There's going to be moments, or heck, even seasons, in which you just don't do as well as you would have liked to have done. In fact, this is probably true for everybody, obviously not just for basketball players. It's true for all of us in every area of our life. We don't always do the best job of accepting the fact that failure is part of the process. We assume that things should always go well, always go smoothly, and we should never have setbacks. And I've talked about on the show a few times, a couple things here that are on this subject is Google the path of success versus the path of failure. Just Google it and look at the pictures and try to find these memes. But there's a lot of memes out there that show how people perceive success, whereas somebody starts on something and they just succeed. They immediately succeed. And then on the right-hand side or on the other side, they'll show how success really looks like. And generally they show a line leading to a failure, and then a line leading to another failure, and then a line leading to another failure. And it shows all of these failures along this really long path that is winding and twisting and turning. And then eventually the failure path leads to success. So the straight line one says how people think success is, and then the wavy line one says how success generally is, how it is in reality. And this is very true. We get in our heads that success should be a straight line, when in reality, most people who are successful at what they do follow this path of perpetual failure. What this really means is that we realistically only truly fail at something when we give up. So what is the road posts here? Quote, C.S. Lewis, failures are signposts on the way to... There's a really good quote from C.S. Lewis. And again, C.S. Lewis is one of my all-time favorite authors. But here's one of his quotes. He said, failures, repeated failures, are finger posts on the road to achievement. One fails forward towards success. And that is very similar to the quote that we're working with today, actually. It's almost spot on. You know, you don't have to feel ashamed for being where you are, because failure is a component of being a successful person. The question is whether or not you're actually heading somewhere, and whether or not you're allowing those failures and setbacks to crush you under their weight to the point of just giving up. So that leads into that next part of the quote where it says, all you have to focus on is one small thing you can do today to get closer to where you want to be. Are we taking a look at our goals and ourselves in the proper scope? There is something that when you're working on a project or in project management, and you may be familiar with this language if you're in the business world, but they have something that's called scope. And there's a scope of a project. And what that means is there's a certain aspect of the project that has certain responsibilities to it. And if you take on a big, massive project, let's say something like building the Empire State Building, right? This isn't really just one big project. This is a project that has a culmination of many, many, many small projects that have small scopes. There's the people who supply the materials. That's one scope of the project. There's the people who mix the cement necessary to build the building. That's another scope of the project. Then there's a group of people who actually build the base and foundation of the building. That's another scope. So there's all these smaller scopes of a much larger project. If we visualize ourselves outside of the realistic scope of a project, then the project becomes incredibly overwhelming. Everyone will sit there and say, how is it even possible to do something this large? And if you're constantly focused on the giant scope, then the act of mixing the cement together starts to feel like a not only tedious task, but an unnecessary one. And so what they've learned over time is when you're working on this big, huge project, the best thing you can do is break it down into these smaller projects that have an appropriate limited scope for the people who are working on that specific part. And they've specialized in that specific part. So what we're doing then in that respect is we are trying to work on an area of our life in which makes the most sense for that moment in the context, right? It's in the smaller, limited scope of whatever it is we're working on in our lives. So if we are shooting for a changing career, the smaller scope of that would be, well, what skills do I need to acquire today to move me in that direction of what career I want to have in the next 5 to 10 years? And realistically, we can't assume that tomorrow morning we're going to be ready for that. And so focusing on this one small thing we can do today kind of gives us the appropriate scope of the overall project. Now, you don't have to be an expert or a project manager to be able to do something like this. The point is to make sure that you're constantly limiting your scope on a day in, day out so that you can get through the daily drudgery of where you want to be in the next 2 to 5 years, because these big projects take time, right? You can't build an empire overnight. You have to start with these smaller foundational things. And so we really need to make sure we focus on the one small thing we have to do today, even if it's just one small thing on the checkbox that moves us in that direction. Before we move further into that, Wisdom Worth Knowing is brought to you by Amazon Audible. If you're like me and you love reading but don't have the time, then Audible audiobooks may be the perfect solution for you. With Audible, listening is the new reading. You can pop in your earbuds and discover that next exciting adventure or expand your knowledge from any PC, Mac, Android, Alexa, or Apple device. And check this out. Because you listen to this show, for a limited time, my listeners can get access to thousands of audiobooks from Audible's Premium Plus catalog completely free. Just visit audible.wisdomworthknowing.org right now and take advantage of a free 30-day trial. That's right, for 30 days, you'll get full access to Audible's Premium Plus catalog as well as an additional free title of your choosing. If you discover audiobooks aren't for you, no problem. You can cancel instantly online. That's it. It's that simple. 2 years ago, audiobooks began to change my life, and they may change yours too. Pause this podcast and head over to audible.wisdomworthknowing.org. That's audible.wisdomworthknowing.org. Sign up for a limited time. So that's one of the biggest parts of, I think, the paths to success, or to a successful focus. Because if you think about these big areas of our lives in which we want to become really, really proficient in, whether it is, okay, let's get in shape. Maybe that smaller step or that smallest step to focus on today, the scope of today, what can we do today, is going for a small walk. Maybe it's 10 to 15 minutes of cardio a day. That's something that we can take immediately control over. We can grasp onto that and we can own it. We can knock that part out today. Maybe it's doing 10 to 20 push-ups. Maybe it's going to the gym. Whatever that small aspect of the larger goal you can do is where your focus should be. The focus shouldn't be continually on the overall. And this is incredibly difficult for me because it's easy to get wrapped up in the overall and then get so overwhelmed with the sheer scope of what it is you're trying to do that you go into what I like to call analysis paralysis. And that is that you get so overwhelmed in what the end goal is that the small, tedious, arguably most important parts of it start to seem unimportant. When in reality, you can't build a skyscraper without a foundation or cement or the materials, right? Like, these are all absolutely essential components into the successful building of a building. You can't, it's not something you can just fudge. And so if we devalue the things that are literally the foundation of our end goal, then we've almost doomed ourselves to failure before we even start. And then there's this aspect of the quote where it goes into the next part where it says, all you have to do is focus on the one small thing you can do today to get closer to where you want to be. Slowly and lightly, which implies steady pace. Don't be in a hurry. Do the small thing that's getting you to where you want to be with the proper attention. Don't try to rush through it. In fact, maybe you should stop and enjoy the small step that's getting you in that right direction. And then one step at a time, you can get there. And sure, maybe we never do inevitably build that skyscraper. But think about how proficient you can become in all of the base components that lead up to this goal you're achieving. And then as you've developed the skills and the discipline of accomplishing these smaller goals well, you actually can become better at it the next time you attempt it. So sure, maybe you didn't accomplish the specific weight goal you wanted. Maybe you got halfway there. But I tell you what, 50% of progress and then being satisfied with the end result is better than 0% and having never started. So that's still, there's no way you can lose. Seriously, unless you get so rigid in your expectations of your final outcome that you crush yourself under the disappointment of not having gotten there, you have nowhere to go but up, just through taking those small steps and learning to master slowly and lightly these smaller aspects of heading in the right direction. Because all of the skills you acquire along the way, which can be discipline, routine, habit forming, or maybe it is actually smaller skills. Maybe it is things like building strength and endurance through exercise. That'll help you with other things you try to do and accomplish. Maybe it is project management if you're working for a major work goal. Maybe it is taking better care of your home. I mean, these are all skills that are the smaller scope of bigger projects, but you don't lose these skills if the overall project fails. You've accumulated a whole set of skills that now can be picked up and migrated to a new overall goal. And if we look at our lives as an overall complex dynamic of all of the things that we want to do or hope to do, if we're making small decisions every day moving toward an end goal in mind, and realizing that all of the small things we pick up along the way, the emotional tools, the physical tools, the skills and the knowledge and the expertise and the failures that we've overcome. And maybe we're just getting good at failing, but if we look at all these small things that we've accumulated, those things don't just vanish when you decide at some point, you know what, this is what I thought I wanted. Let me change my direction to something else. Maybe I don't want this. Maybe overall as my scope, I do actually want to shift to this. Because you've shifted your overall goals, that doesn't mean that you haven't acquired a tremendous amount of skill and ability towards the original. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick up those skills you've acquired and you're going to set them down toward a different goal or toward a different focus. And then you're probably going to start being successful at moving toward that at a faster pace this time around than you were originally. That way, I think it isn't. There's two things that can kind of be traps here. So I think there's one thing we need to avoid or be careful of is we don't want to constantly shift our overall scope, because if we don't commit ourselves to something for a long enough period of time, a singular thing, we don't spend enough time with it to accumulate the smaller scope of the project things well. So we do need to be careful not to abandon our overall projects frequently, which is definitely a trap, especially in our culture today, in which There's so many options, and you can get into an option paralysis or selection paralysis of committing to something. So we don't want to abandon commitments too quickly. So when we do actually set our focus on something, we should make sure that we give ourselves sufficient time so that we don't give up just when things start to get hard or at the first sign of things getting difficult. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is we don't want to be too rigid in our goals. If we keep running up against impossible things that we as individuals cannot overcome, it is possible that that goal is either too rigid, our expectations are too rigid for it, and it's not something that a single human could possibly do, or that we won't ever possess the skills to get there, which again still isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as we are growing. Or it could be that maybe that goal needs revisited and reevaluated because maybe our priorities have changed. Maybe we've learned that that isn't necessarily the most appropriate thing for us to aim toward. And so that's definitely something we do need to watch out for, because we don't want to adopt things to an extreme degree that can necessarily be unhealthy for us. So I'm actually going to try to spend the last tiny chunk of this video reminding myself, even with the things like developing this podcast, this is incredibly overwhelming for me a lot of times. And I've talked to people and they're like, it seems like it comes so easily to you. And let me tell you something, this topic we're talking about today is actually one of my singular biggest struggles. I have struggled with the sin of lust, and I don't mean in a sexual context in this. I struggle with it to wanting to be somewhere I am not. And so what really, really hurts me in the short term is seeing the daily statistics and it not growing the way I think it should be growing. And I can get so obsessed with where I'm not yet that it's incredibly discouraging and disheartening. And this episode's been really good for me because it is a reminder that it doesn't matter. Did I wake up today and take the small steps that move me in the direction to carry this where I want it to be? And even if it never ends up where I wanted it to be, if I was able to accomplish that small daily focus task that took me slowly and lightly one step closer, then I was successful. I can count this whole experiment successful because the discipline that I'm cultivating is at least a skill that I've acquired along the way. And even if a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, I'm not still sitting here doing it because my goal has shifted, and hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully I've stuck with it that long and that it still is of value to others and myself at that point in time. But even if it doesn't, it does not change the fact that I did it. You know what I mean? I woke up this morning, I walked downstairs, I got my cup of coffee, I sat down and I did it today. And that is a success. Even if the overall project didn't come to completion, there was growth in that process. And it's something I do have to remind myself of regularly because it is so easy to get disheartened because you think something should be where it is not yet. And a lot of that time is just me not accepting reality for what it is. That everything that we do, everything we dedicate time to takes a tremendous amount of time and energy if we want to do it well. And then there's sometimes situations where we dedicate ourselves to something and it just never works out. And we have to be realistic to a point. That's life. This entire project here may end up being one of the failure points on my road when it's all said and done and all wrapped up. And I need to be okay with that. Hopefully it's not, but it could be. You've been listening to the Wisdom Worth Knowing podcast. I'm your host, Craig Chamberlain. I want to thank you for joining me today in this live stream. Please, before you go, like, share, and subscribe on your favorite social network. It helps feed the algorithms so that the show can continue to grow. You can visit the website at wisdomworthknowing.org where you can donate as well. You can also subscribe through the website to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. And if you do find that we are not on a specific network for podcasts, please let me know. You can ping me on Twitter or Facebook or wherever it might be so that I can find out why we're not listed there yet. We should be aggregated everywhere at this point, so I can work on that. And before we close out for today, remember, you don't have to solve your whole life overnight. And you don't have to feel ashamed for being where you are. All you have to focus on is one small thing you can do today to get closer to where you want to be. Slowly and lightly, one step at a time, you can get there. Thanks again for joining me today. I just wanted to kind of absorb that quote for a moment, because it's so powerful if we can grasp onto this concept that we are all of the small things we do every day are the most important things. How well we take care of our families, how well we take care of our kids, how well we do at our job, how well we take care of our homes, how well we take care of our bodies. The world is going to tell you that these things do not matter, that they're not a big deal, that they're not enough, they're not sufficient. But I'm here to tell you that these are the most important things. The cornerstones of our lives are the people who wake up every day and they get to work on the seemingly unimportant things and they do them well. Everything that we take for granted in our everyday lives are built on these people. We owe it to ourselves and to those we love to take ownership of the small corner of the life that we are currently living, to master it. Can you imagine if every person, the 7 billion people on the planet, woke up today and took complete and full ownership and responsibility for the thing right in front of them? Whether that be to stay sober today, whether that be to clean their room today, whether that be to spend 15 minutes on the treadmill today because their health is important. Imagine what the world would look like in a month, a year, 5 years, 10 years. If we all stopped looking at the mountaintop experiences or seeking the mountaintop experiences and thinking that we need to be at the top of the pyramid and understood that a pyramid can't stand without a foundation. Just imagine what the world would look like if we could do that. We can't do that for other people. We need to do it ourselves. All we can do is set the example. This is the Wisdom Worth Knowing podcast. I'm your host, Craig Chamberlain, and have yourself a wonderful day. And as always, let's work on being the best version of ourselves we can today, because that's all we can do.